All right, good evening everyone. Welcome to Web Animations Made Fast and Fun. My name's Brian Birtles and this is Daisuke Akatsuka. We're both based in Tokyo where we're working on animations in Firefox. We work on animations in Firefox, but I'm also involved in animation standards, and Daisuke also does a lot of work, in fact all the work, on Firefox's animation dev tools. So tonight I want to talk to you a bit about those two things, animation technologies and Firefox's animation dev tools. But before we get stuck into that, I'd like to hear from you. Has anybody here ever made animations for the web? Please raise your hand if you have. Okay, pretty good. Has anyone here ever used CSS animations or transitions? Wow, that's really good. This one I'm not so sure about. Web Animations API. Has anybody ever heard of the Web Animations API? Wow, okay, couple there. One last one. Has anybody ever seen the Animation Inspector dev tools in Firefox? Okay, not so many. Good, that's good. I was afraid that you might already know everything, but that's great. Let's step back for a moment and talk about web animations. Animations are great. You can do all sorts of things with animations. You can tell stories with animations. This is a traditional Japanese fairy tale. Last year, Daisuke and I worked with a Japanese animator to make a web version of the fairy tale. This is just a slightly sped up version of it. But you can do all sorts of things. This is all just using web animation technology. You can also use animations to explain user interfaces. So, for example, this is the new Firefox Quantum, and if you go to save a pocket bookmark, there'll be an animation which will tell you where that bookmark went to so you can find it again. Animation's often the most intuitive way to explain user interfaces. But also, animations can just be fun. I'm sure you all know this animation from Twitter, and it doesn't actually have a lot of purpose, but it's really fun. And that's quite important because if your users are having fun, they're going to be more engaged with your app or your website. They're going to have good impressions of your brand. They're more likely to recommend it to their friends. And all sorts of positive things come when your users are having fun. So animations are quite integral in making your users have an enjoyable time. But the problem with web animations is they're really hard. I think if anyone here has tried to make web animations, you know it just takes a lot of time to get it right. And so tonight what we want to do is introduce some of those web animation technologies, hopefully make it fun, but also show you how to make those animations really fast as well, make them really smooth, that is. And to do that, we want to show you the Firefox dev tools. We want to explain the web technologies using the developer tools that Daisuke has been working on. So we're going to get stuck into that, but we think they're really great. One other thing I'd like to point out, we're not the only people who think they're great. Rachel Neighbours is a famous animator who's actually with Microsoft, but just last week she was saying when she goes to make web animations and uses developer tools, she uses Firefox apparently. So that's a pretty good endorsement, I think. So we look forward to introducing those tools to you. So let's get stuck into it. We're going to do some live coding, but I realise that for some people, you learn more by doing and by fiddling than by just listening. So if you have a laptop with you, especially a laptop with Firefox installed, and you prefer to follow along with some of the code samples, then please just open up this URL and you'll see the code samples there and you can fiddle with them as we discuss them. So the URL is a bit.ly URL. It's 2 little y, big A, big F, big P, and a little X. Hopefully you got that. I'll give you just a moment to type that in before we change screen. I don't know. I had to get an SMS sent to me to log in. Yeah, sorry. Good luck. Yes, so I realise that could be a problem, but for those of you who can get on, that's the URL, and I think we're probably ready to move on. All right, okay. So if you open that URL, you should see this page here. And if you've got Firefox installed, please open up the DevTools as well. You can press F12 to do that. So we're going to start with CSS transitions because they're dead simple. CSS transitions are basically a way to say to the browser, when the CSS on this element changes, animate it. All you need to do in order to make that happen is to tell the browser how long to animate it for. That's all. So we have a hover selector here. When we hover over the logo, it gets bigger. And so in order to animate that, we just need to say how long to animate it for. So that's, we say transition duration, say 1 second. And we have an animation. And if you just type that in, congratulations, you're now a web animator. And the other thing which you'll notice is down here in the developer tools, that animation showed up. It's blue, which means it's a transition. And you can see a bit of the shape of the animation, you know, how it starts slowly and then gets faster. And you can actually drag along the top to seek it backwards and forwards, and you can speed it up too if you like. And you can see the properties that are being animated down the bottom. So, transitions, dead simple. There are a few other knobs you can dial, things you can change. So for example, you can add a delay if you want a delayed reaction. For example, we can make it delayed by a second, and then it starts. And again, in the developer tools, you can see there's this line there indicating the delay. You can even make it negative if you want the transition to jump into the middle. So there you go. And you can actually see in the developer tools how it's been cut off. You can also change the way the animation eases in and out. This transition timing function property, the default is ease, but we can do things like this steps effect, which is kind of like a robot-like animation where it jumps in and out. And you can see that again in the developer tools, how that works. There's also, if you're really boring, you can use linear, which is just a straight line. Or there's other ones like, say, ease. Yeah, actually. We can also, we can't edit animations in the inspector yet, but we can use the rules panel to do that. So you can find the element in the rules panel. Sorry about the screen. And then you can tweak the timing function there as well. Apart from that, you might want to animate more than one property. By default, every property gets animated, every property is transitioned. But you can, so the default is all, but you can say just do the transform, for example. Or you can also transition different properties differently. So in this example, we're changing both the transform and the opacity, and you might say do the transform over 1 second, but the opacity over 2 seconds. All these properties are lists, so you can just match up the different property values to animate them differently. And again, you see in the developer tools, they come up as different transitions. And that's a lot to write, so as with a lot of CSS properties, you can write it as a shorthand as well. And that is really all there is to transitions. They're very simple, but you can actually do quite a lot with them. If you find there's something you can't do with them though, then you probably need CSS animations. So I want to very quickly introduce CSS animations. And we have an example here, and you'll notice there's a big difference with CSS animations. It's not about just a simple change, but you actually define the whole story of the animation using something called a keyframes block. It has a name, and then you say at different times, at different points in the animation, what the different properties should be. With transitions, all we needed to say was how long it takes, but for animations, we need to say how long it takes and what the name is of this keyframes that we're using. And if we do that, you can see we get this effect here, and you'll notice the colour's different. It's now a orange animation. That's because it's a CSS animation as opposed to a transition. We can use all the same properties that we have for transitions. So we can set the delays and the timing functions and so on. But there's a few extra properties that come with CSS animations. One of them is the ability to repeat the animation. So there's this very poorly named animation iteration count property. And we can use that to say, for example, that we want this animation to run 5 times. And as you see in the developer tools, it comes up 5 times. And interestingly, though, the bottom picture only comes up once. And that's just showing us where we are within a single run of the animation. We can also change the direction of the animation with something called the animation direction. We can make it run backwards by saying reverse. And you can see the graph now goes backwards, and this thing goes backwards. And we can also make it go backwards and forwards using alternate. And kind of, I guess, what you'd expect. One other feature of animations, because we're not just animating an existing change, we're telling a story. Sometimes what we want to do is we want to say, at the end of the animation, stay at the last point. And so for that, we have this animation fill mode property, where we say, if we don't add it, then the animation snaps back to where it was before you started it. But if we say forwards, then it'll stick to the end. And if you've got a long delay and you want the animation to be stuck to its beginning position before it starts, then you have backwards for that, or both, for both. As well as that, with transitions, we only have a start value and an end value, and we have a separate transition for each property that changes. But with animations, we can mix them all together. We can have lots of different values, and they can all be mixed into the one. So in this example, we want to animate the background color. And you can see that that comes up as a separate property down the bottom, and it's actually, because it's a color, we show you the actual colors on the graph. And I believe that is about all we have to say for animations. Animations are not much more complicated than that. Sorry, there was a requirement tonight that every slide show has to have Bruce Lee in it somewhere. Yeah, so I think we can tick that box now. So the question that always comes up at this point, though, is when do I use transitions? When do I use animations? And to put it fairly simply, transitions are when you have a state change from A to B and you just want to animate it. Animations are basically for everything else. It's especially if you're repeating something like a spinner, or if you've got a very complex story where you're going not just A to B, but through all sorts of points along the way. But it's also if you have an animation that goes back to where it starts, like you've got a box and you want it to jump up and down for a little bit and then stop where it started. That's not really a state change, it's just a visual flourish. And so that's where you want the CSS animation. If that still doesn't make sense, try using transitions. If it doesn't work, try using CSS animations. The next question, though, of course, is why don't I just use JavaScript? JavaScript has heaps of different libraries that you can use, and so why wouldn't you just stick with them? Well, there's different reasons to use JavaScript and different reasons to use CSS. For JavaScript, it's very powerful. You can do anything you want, basically. But for CSS, it has the advantage that it's very simple, just like we saw with the transitions. You can have animations in no time. On the other hand, JavaScript is more appropriate if you're doing very dynamic animations that are open-ended. Maybe they're moving somewhere new based on a mouse click or something like that. But CSS has a surprising advantage of being fast. And that's something which I need to explain a little bit about. Fast meaning smooth. It's a little bit controversial to say that, but I'll explain why. I realise that animation performance is not exciting for everyone like it is for me, so I'll keep it very short. But I think you'll agree, even if you're not engineering inclined, that you want your animations to be smooth. And so, to put it very, very simply, the one thing you need to remember is whether using JavaScript or CSS, whenever possible, try to animate transform and opacity. And there's a reason for that, and that's because when the browser goes to update those animations, if you're using transform or opacity, it can often, normally it can use the computer or the phone's GPU to update it. And that means it has a much better chance of doing it smoothly. That's true for every browser, not just Firefox. And that might seem really, really limiting. Just transform and opacity, what can you possibly do with that? The answer is, if you're a little bit creative, quite a lot. So the animation we showed you beforehand is all done with transform and opacity, except I think for the text. We used a filter animation to blur the text in. everything else is just transform and opacity. Even say a color fade, you can just have two colored elements and just fade one out, and then you can get a color fade that way. So you can actually get quite a long way with that. I hope in future that we will be able to expand that set of properties that we can optimize, like transform and opacity. But in 2017, they're the two ones which are going to give you the best performance. So transform and opacity, you can use them and you can still have this problem where it runs smoothly for a bit, but then it stops and starts. And your users like Batman get really angry when they see this. What is going on here? We're using the right properties, but it's janking, I think was the word we got before. It's a janky animation. How do we fix this? The problem is, even though the browser can update the animation quickly, it's got other things to do at the same time. So it might be running other scripts, or maybe another tab is even running another script, or maybe it's doing some housework or something like that, I don't know. And so the animation just kind of stops while it's waiting for the browser to get around to updating it. What we really want to do is take that animation and move it to another independent part of the browser that can just run independently. And we can do that. All browsers can do that. They call them different things, sometimes compositor animations, off-main thread animations, or GPU animations. That's completely wrong, but they're sometimes called GPU animations. And all the current browsers are able to do this. But the condition is the browser needs to know everything about the animation to begin with, so it can do that. And Firefox will actually tell you when it's doing this. So we can have a look at a little demo of this. All right, so in this animation, we're doing transform and opacity. And if you probably can't see this, but there's actually a little lightning bolt mark here. And if you hover over the animation, it actually says down the bottom, all animation properties are optimized. That means it's actually running this animation on the compositor, this independent bit of the browser that's not going to get interrupted. And if you look over here as well, next to each of these properties, there are these lightning bolt marks as well, saying that those properties are being optimized. The browser can't always do that. There's some reasons it might choose not to do that. For example, if we put padding left in, if you animate padding and transform at the same time, and one of those is optimized and one's not, they're going to get out of sync and it's going to look really funny. So the browser will see that and say, I don't think you want to be doing this transform animation on the compositor, and so it'll actually not do that. And in Firefox, you'll see a little dotted line under the transform property, and if you hover over that, it'll tell you why it's not optimized like it could be. So if you find your animation's not going as smoothly as you think it should, sometimes you can get some help just by looking in the developer tools. So, smooth animations, no problem. Except there was that one condition. If the browser's going to run this animation in a separate place that's not going to get interrupted, it needs to know everything about the animation up front. And so that means this only applies to CSS animations and CSS transitions. So what do we do about JavaScript? Well, there's good news for that. There's actually a new API called Web Animations API just for this. Finally got there. This is, yes, Web Animations. And this is just an API that lets you say from JavaScript, here's the animation I'm trying to run, and then the browser can optimize it in all the same ways it does for CSS animations and CSS transitions. So we'll have a quick look at how that works. So this is the rough shape of the API. You just say what properties you want to animate and their values. And then in this case, we're saying, and run that for 1,000 milliseconds, which is, in JavaScript, you normally talk in milliseconds. The other advantage of using this API is that these animations actually show up in the dev tools as well. So you can inspect them and play with them there. And of course, you have all the same options that you have with CSS animations and transitions too. You can set the direction and so on. And there's even a few extra ones like end delay, which is helpful for synchronizing things. For example, you can make that positive or even negative, and that will show up in the developer tools too. So that, yeah, there's a negative end delay. And again, we can use that to synchronize different events. So that's Web Animations API. It's amazing, right? Yeah. The problem with Web Animations API is browser support. So at the moment, Web Animations is only supported. Oh, sorry, one last thing I forgot to show. You can also add an ID to an animation just to help you find it in the developer tools that will show up here. Sorry. So the problem with Web Animations is browser support. And at the moment, it's only supported by Firefox and Chrome. Safari are in the process of implementing it. And I'm sure as soon as they release it, Edge will follow suit. So for now, if you want to use this in a production site, you'll want to use this polyfill as well. When you use the polyfill, it will fall back to the native optimized implementation in Firefox and Chrome, but in Safari and Edge, it'll run in JavaScript. And if you want to know more about this, I wrote a blog about this about a year ago, and that will just explain a little bit more of the performance stuff for people who are interested in that sort of thing. Right, well that's about it for web standards and technology. Firefox Quantum, the new Firefox. Surely there must be all sorts of amazing animation things in the new Firefox that we've been talking about. Well, there's a couple of things. The first one is basically, Ali already explained all of this. What we have been working on, Daisuke and I and a number of others, is taking this Servo project, this is the Servo project logo, this browser written in Rust, taking its style system, putting it in Firefox. So you get this hybrid beauty here on the right. By and large, as a web developer, you shouldn't really notice any difference except that it's faster. We fixed a few bugs along the way. Things are running in Rust and parallel and all that sort of thing, but generally things should work the same as they always did. The other difference that you'll see though in this new Firefox Quantum is there's more animation in the user interface, this Photon codenamed project. You might have seen this icon when you refresh a page. And would you believe this is actually done with CSS animations and it's only done with the transform property? Whoa, how is that possible? Well, it's using this very long SVG file. And what we do is we simply move that bit by bit to the right using that steps timing function and then just hide the rest of the graphic. Yeah, actually this is a page explaining how it works, and if you look in the developer tools, you can actually see, no, you probably can't, but there's a steps timing function going along there. And you'll also notice that the lightning bolt is there, which means that this animation is running in this special compositor where it's not going to be interrupted. So even if the browser gets busy, that animation is going to keep running smoothly. And we've used that technique in a number of places in the Firefox UI, like these throbber animations. And interestingly, we use the Web Animations API to synchronize those throbber animations using a part of the API which I'll mention in just a moment. And so that brings us to our last part of this presentation, which is what can you expect from animations in the future, both in Firefox but in the web in general. And just very briefly, in terms of CSS animations and transitions, if you've tried to use CSS transitions in an app or something complicated where you're using transition end events, you've probably had a disappointing time because sometimes transitions can just disappear. You can change the DOM and the element's gone and then the transition's gone and the transition end event never comes. This is something we found a lot with Firefox OS when we were working on that. So we've added a new transition cancel event which will tell you if that transition's gone and you should stop waiting for it to finish. And that's shipping in Firefox along with a number of other events, and I expect other browsers will implement that soon. Another thing we've been working on is having animations that combine together and mesh together, and that's actually implemented in both Firefox and Chrome, but it's not released yet, and it's not yet available to CSS, only through the Web Animations API. And the other part is a part of the Web Animations API that ties CSS animations to web animations, so you can do things like, I think I have an example here. You can get all the animations in the document, whether they're CSS animations or transitions or web animations, and you can pause them all. Or you can inspect an element and see if it's animated using that same get animations. This is again something we've implemented, but not yet released. As far as web animations goes, we're working on improving that too, to make the API a little easier to use so that you can, for example, leave out some of the keyframes, and also to add some promises so that you can do things like this. You can wait for the animation to finish easily and then do something after that. And there's some other things as well, some more ambitious proposals we're working on together with Google and Apple to, for example, have animations driven by a scroll and animations that run in worklets, which is something very complicated, which I don't know anything about. Yes, DevTools. I'll hand over to Daisuke to introduce DevTools.
I want to talk a bit. For DevTools, we will advance what is written here. I will introduce a few things quickly. First, keyframe is inspection. Actually, we can specify the easing to each keyframes. We will visualize to understand this. Also, this feature was released in maybe yesterday or today's nightly build. So we can, you can use now. And the next, grouping. Although current inspector displays existent animations on document sequentially, it will be more understandable if we handle animation which start at the same timing as group. For example, these hearts are animated independently. We will treat this as a different group so we can investigate each. Finally, this, for now, also we focus to inspect, but we want to support adding, removing, and editing. This means we can say it as authoring tool rather than the inspection tool. In the future, we may be able to create whole animation on the browser.
I think one more thing about DevTools is we're currently rewriting them in React and looking to move that code to GitHub. So I hope that you would enjoy contributing to that more easily. We can make the best animation dev tools ever. Yeah. Sorry, that wasn't actually what I was supposed to finish. Yeah, if you want to find out more about any of these topics, here are some Twitter accounts. I think Daisuke tweets once every 4 years or so, so you should look out for the next one. And today's slides, if you want to look up any of the links we introduced, you can get to these slides from this very awkward URL here. And thank you very much.